Thank you, Matt, for your introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I feel very special because this is the second time I've spoken in this auditorium. So that was a different topic. Today I'm going to speak to you about lessons I've learned from working with athletes with an impairment. This is quite an interesting picture over here. Anybody know why? Because Pistorius is on this picture over here, and why it's an interesting picture is because he comes out of jail today. So he's being released today. But he won't be running in the IPC World Championships here in Doha. But this man will. This is Arnaud Fourie, who's one of the contenders in this race, which is the T43-44. And this is the blue ribboned event of this particular championship. So this is where I hail from. This beautiful area is a place in close to Cape Town in South Africa, which is called Stellenbosch. It's a small town which holds about 100,000 people. And the very special part of this town is that the 30 to 40,000 of those people are all students, and a very physically active student population, and sport is the home of this area. This is another area which really chooses to promote itself as a venue for Northern Hemisphere athletes in the off-season, coming to train in this area away from the lights of the big city. Now, we have two campuses. This is our medical campus. This is the second largest hospital in South Africa. It has 2,000 beds, and this is the academic medical school here. And these are the various different facilities in sport and exercise medicine at the medical school campus. About 20 minutes from here, we have the main campus, which houses most of the sports facilities. And of particular interest here is that on this mountain, beg your pardon, which you see in this area, this is quite a large mountain. And this is where they held the World Cross Country Championships. This is a world-sanctioned cross-country course. And next year, the cycling UCI will hold the World Mountain Bike Championships on this course. So this is a wonderful place to see, and I invite you all to come and visit us in Stellenbosch. As many of you know, it's also famous for a very good red liquid that is often imbibed by many people coming to this part of the world. We're also a research center for disability sport, and that's really what I'm going to be speaking to you about today. But I think before I get there, let me give you one more official invitation that next year, not 2017, it's 2016, the IOC will be having the Advanced Team Physician Training course in Stellenbosch in South Africa from the 17th to the 19th of November. So if there's a good reason to come to Stellenbosch, it will be that, to come and participate in this course. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, ladies and gentlemen. As Matt told you, my history was actually with the South African Olympic team. And I was the chief medical officer for Sydney Olympic Games and then for the Athens Olympic Games. And when it came to Beijing, I put in my application, as one does, and I got a letter back saying, "Dear Professor Derman, we're very happy to announce that you've been allocated as the medical officer to the Paralympic team." And I looked at this and I thought, no, this can't be right. They've made a typographical error. So I phoned the gentleman who wrote me the letter and I said to him, "I'm very sorry, but you've made a typographical error." So he said, "Why?" I said, "It says Paralympic team here. My expertise is obviously in elite athletes." So he says, "No, there's no mistake. You've been allocated to the Paralympic team." So I decided to withdraw, and in disgust, I actually took my name off the list, and I told them that I'm no longer available for selection or going with. And then my wife had a chat with me, And she started speaking a little bit to me, and some of my colleagues said, listen, Wayne, why don't you just go and actually see what this is all about? So with an element of reluctance, I took my place in this team here. You can see there I stand here. And I remember when this picture was taken in Beijing, looking around me and seeing all these wheelchairs and thinking, my word, this is just not me. I haven't actually got what it takes to be here. How am I going to deal with all the medical problems of all of these athletes? So what I want to tell you about is what actually transpired in my life after the day that this particular picture was taken. So as a background, it's important that you know that more than 15% of the world population are disabled, of one type of disability or another. That is a massive, massive segment of the population. And if you think about it, you will know either a family member or someone close to your family or a friend who is disabled, either visually disabled, in a wheelchair, has a limp, or has some kind of disability that impairs functional performance. Another important thing that you should know, and I'll show you here the famous Brazilian with holding a 1 year to go to Rio. When you look at the numbers involved in Paralympic sport, if you project the figures in growth from Beijing to London to now Rio, Paralympic sport is set to eclipse FIFA as the second largest sporting event in the world. So this is a massive area, not only a massive amount of people in the world who are disabled, but as a sporting spectacle, the Paralympic Games are significant, and the media attention in the Paralympic Games are significant. And for those of you who like to think about delicate technical things in medicine, this is an area that you'd love to get involved in. Let me point out something. These men here are all running the same race. Okay, they're all close to the finish line. But if you have a look, every one of them has got something different. So here you see the South African athlete who has had a double below elbow amputation. This Chinese athlete has got one full arm and he's been decorticated at the shoulder. This French athlete has got one normal arm, he's got a through elbow amputation, and he's got a kind of a prosthesis there to balance him out as he drives through in the race. And this man over here has got an arm that has had either probably a brachial plexus injury, and renders that arm useless or is in the form of a stiff, contracted arm. So one has to take all of these disabilities into account and actually apply a system to them that allow all of these people to have a fair competition in one race. And that event is called classification. And classification tries to ensure that there is equity and there is fairness in the Paralympic sports. We don't always get it right, but it is an evolving science that is happening to actually try and ensure this. So, when I was appointed to the Paralympic team, I went and I tried to do a crash course in disability sports medicine. And I went to the books, and what did the books tell me? Well, you get a couple of types of different athletes that have impairment. You get your spinal cord injured athletes, you get your wheelchairs, then you get your blind athletes or your visually impaired athletes, then you get your intellectually impaired athletes, then you get people with cerebral palsy, and then you get people who have amputations, and then you have a sixth group where all the other people fit into, and that's called les autres, which is the others, and that will be people with hemimelia, it will be people who are short of stature or have dwarfism, and they will fit into that sixth group. So when you go to the textbooks and you try and you look for actual scientific stuff about Paralympic athletes, there just isn't anything available besides people's experiential evidence of actually working with athletes. So you won't find a lot of information out there. But what you will find is that people who are in wheelchairs or wheelchair users have either spinal cord injuries, they would either be quadriplegic or paraplegic, or have had polio. You'd also have people particularly who have high double amputations, also using wheelchairs, plus people with very bad cerebral palsy will have wheelchairs as well. And what a wheelchair does is it turns your shoulders into weight-bearing joints. Usually our weight-bearing joints are bottom down, they're the lower limb. In Paralympic athletes, these are the weight-bearing joints, particularly with respect to those who are using wheelchairs. So this is a gentleman who's had a bilateral lower limb amputation. So you can see that the only way he's got of getting around is using his upper limbs. So you'll see that his overuse injuries are repetitive strain, biceps tendinopathy, also that there's a leading limb, so one of his limbs will be dominant. There are certain muscle imbalances. Typically in a wheelchair user who's used to pushing and propelling through a wheelchair, you'd find that abduction strength is the greatest. There's an abnormality of abduction-adduction strengths, and that leads to a superior displacement of the humeral head, and that has got its own problems. So often we will find that the suprascapular nerve is entrapped, and there's a branch to the infraspinatus which is also affected. Now, can you imagine telling this athlete who's in a wheelchair to rest? There's no such thing, because how does he get around just from one place to another, from the bathroom to the bedroom? Is he uses a wheelchair. So the concept of rest for a Paralympic athlete is a very relative thing. One decreases the amount of time, and that is what one needs for rest. Now, if one looks at athletes in the wheelchair, and particularly if you have a very high spinal cord lesion, then we'll start finding that there are also all different unique types of illegal performance enhancing that these athletes care to participate in. And one of these practices of the athletes is something called boosting. Now, boosting is the intentional induction of autonomic dysreflexia. And this gives you a rise in your blood pressure, and a rise in the blood pressure of a spinal cord injured athlete or a tetraplegic has been shown to confer about a 10% increase in performance. So this is akin to taking performance-enhancing drugs. So the IPC strictly bans the practice of boosting and has developed a protocol for boosting. So how is boosting done? Well, it's in the T51, 52, and 53 classes. These are typically athletes who are quadriplegic, who have high lesions. What they do is they induce a painful stimulus, but they can't feel it because they've got no sensation. So what are the types of things that they do is they either block their catheter to allow the distension of the bladder, and then on the warm-up track, they will be seen hitting the bladder like this, which actually causes a response from the sympathetic chain. And when you get that response from the sympathetic chain, you get the pouring out of epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that causes the blood pressure to go up. It also causes piloerection. The athletes can get a headache, and it is indeed a health risk for these athletes. So this is the type of doping that we have in Paralympic sport. It's very interesting what these athletes will do. They will take needles and put needles into stumps. They will sit on their scrotum, if they can. All of these things to induce a painful stimulus that they can't feel. We often see that they're very sweaty and they're very nervous and hypervigilant. So if you do come to watch the athletics, you will see that at the first call room, we have a station there where we have 2 blood pressure cuffs. And what we do is we measure the blood pressure of the athletes before. We have a cutoff level. You're not allowed to compete if your blood pressure is over 180 systolic. And that's a very high level. We think that it's actually too generous, and over the years we're actually starting to bring that down, because how many spinal cord injured patients have you seen that have got blood pressures anywhere near 180? They're usually about 90 over 60, and if one does raise it, you can raise it probably to 130, but we're not catching those athletes. But what we are doing is we're having an awareness. The athletes know that we're there. The athletes know that we are testing. The athletes know that we have the ability of pulling them out of the race if they've got a high blood pressure. And this is one of the ways that we're trying to make the sport a little bit safer. And this shows in Beijing, a colleague of mine, Stuart Willick, who is testing the blood pressure of one of the athletes. Now, what is very interesting about this competition being held in Doha is that we are very interested in how these athletes do in the heat. This heat illness is one of the big question marks in sport and exercise medicine, if this is an entity that actually exists. And we are very, very interested to see what happens here, because if one goes again to the textbooks, you'll find the following, is that the altered thermoregulation, or the inability of a patient with a spinal cord injury to actually thermoregulate because sweating is diminished, will let them be very susceptible to heat injury. Well, we wait to see. And what happens, we've got a very strict protocol of what to do in the case of increased wet bulb global temperatures. So another reason why heat injury in this population might be a factor is that we know that there's a concomitant effect when medications are used. And many of these athletes are taking either forms of narcotics or other painkillers, antidepressant medications, and other medications which all can make heat illness worse. The converse is true, that if athletes are susceptible to high temperatures, they're also susceptible to low temperatures. Why? Because if this athlete who's close to the ice becomes hypothermic, he has lost his ability to shiver. So shivering is shut off, and you can't shiver to generate heat. But in Sochi, we never got any hypothermia. So we think that the body has got a lot of capacity of resilience to actually deal, even with people with quite severe disabilities, with these extremes of either being too hot or being too cold. Pressure is a big problem, and I'm going to show you a little bit in a while about the skin. But skin problems in athletes in wheelchairs, particularly the more technologically advanced the wheelchairs are, the more you will see that the athlete adopts this kind of position where both knees are brought up into the wheelchair and placed right up against the chest. And what that does is it actually places the ischial tuberosities in direct contact with the chair, and that is where the skin can break down. Remember that these athletes can't feel that they've got any skin breakdown. So one's got to actually look and inspect and do reciprocal inspections of the athletes. And because they're sharing rooms with people, they've actually learned that, listen, I'll have a look at your butt, you'll have a look at mine, and we'll actually see, is there any skin breakdown? But what they do about it is actually also a very interesting thing, which I'm going to tell you about in a minute. Neurogenic bladder. Somebody who's got a spinal cord injury also has a bladder that is twitchy, it's enlarged, it has stasis, incomplete voiding, and again, one has a problem with bladder infections. A bladder infection in a spinal cord injured patient also proves to be a problem. Why? Because they can't feel that they've got a bladder infection. So a lot of these athletes will come to you and they will tell you, they'll say, Doc, and you'll say, what's the problem? I've got a bladder infection. How do you know? I just know. I feel sick. And they will actually let you know that they have a bladder infection, and 9 out of 10 times they're 100% correct. And we actually go on their feelings. We get to know these athletes very, very well, and I take their word for it with a lot of these type of problems. Premature osteoporosis. 2 weeks ago, I had a cyclist with a high spinal cord injury that was just moving from one couch to another onto a beanbag, and both his legs dropped down, and he had a bilateral fracture of the neck of the femur. So osteoporosis is a huge problem. This is a problem in most spinal cord injured patients who are in wheelchairs, and sometimes the first presentation in many of these athletes is a femoral neck fracture. Again, problematic because they don't know that they've fractured the femoral neck. They become dysreflexic. They feel the blood pressure go up, headache and sweaty, and then they know I've somehow, somewhere in my body, I've injured myself quite substantially. Cerebral palsy, we know that there is spasticity. Spasticity predisposes to injury. There's a lot of overuse injuries, and obviously from biomechanical abnormalities that happen in cerebral palsied athletes, their ankle and foot deformities, including equinus, equinovarus, and valgus deformities, and a lot of these athletes present with foot problems. A very high arched foot, poor shock absorbers, and a lot of bone stress injury that occurs particularly in the sprinting athletes. So I want to tell you a little bit about London and my experiences of London, and I want to start making this journey a little personal. One of the things that I was interested about in London is that the British chose to use this slogan for the Paralympic Games, inspire a generation. And to me, I thought, yeah, that's a very, very lofty attribute to actually have, something to go for. It's really aspirational to do that in a Games event. And I thought, okay, well, I'm interested in participating in London, and I followed up on my Beijing experience and went to London again as the Chief Medical Officer of the Paralympic team. Now, many of you in this room perhaps might have been there or watched the London 2012 events. And I want to start showing you the differences between the Olympics and the Paralympics. You know, when in the stadium, both stadiums were packed out. There wasn't a seat to be had in these stadia. And as the moment the gun went off, there was this big sign saying, make some noise. And the most noisy time in the Olympic Games was when Mo Farah won his double gold medal for the United Kingdom. And the stadium went mad, and they registered something like 116 decibels in the stadium. The noisiest moment of the Paralympic Games was when David Weir won his third gold medal for Britain. Do you know that the stadium erupted with a 15% higher decibel rate? And to me, that actually says something about the kind of heart of the Paralympic Games. But for me, moving from Olympics to Paralympics was a very interesting thing. And a lot of people say, why did you find this kind of medical work so interesting? Surely this is something that's not really great in sports medicine. It's not elite sports medicine. I would say that this is probably one of the highest challenges in sport and exercise medicine. Let me explain why. From medicine moving to sports medicine, one's got a much, much bigger scope of practice than any of the other specialties that one goes into. You have to know everything from orthopedics right the way through to chronic disease prevention and treatment. Now what happens is you take the human being and subject them to an exercising environment. In an exercising environment, you are getting the physiology stressed to its maximum. And what you do then is you often unmask the weakest link in the chain of the human being. If you've got underlying heart disease, use exercise to expose it. If you've got an underlying muscle imbalance, you're going to use exercise to expose it, and then an injury happens. Now what happens is you add a further layer of complexity of somebody with a disability, and you've thrown in a complete increased order of magnitude of problem solving in medicine. Let me give you an example. This is a CT scanner. It's in London, and the athlete in this CT scanner is a wheelchair basketball athlete. He came to me and he said, "Doc, I've got a problem. I've got a really sore shoulder and neck, and what's happening on the basketball court is as I'm passing the ball is going like this. I can't throw the ball straight." So I have a look at him, and clearly he's got a weakness that is much more substantial on his right side compared to his left. He tells me that that isn't always the way it has been. Remember, in a Paralympic athlete, you haven't got a normal side to compare to. You've got abnormality everywhere you look, so there's no normal side. So he says to me he really wants to do something about it. Physiotherapy isn't helping. We put him in the MRI scanner, and we see that he's got a disc prolapse from one of the cervical vertebrae right onto one of the nerve roots. So what I would do under normal circumstances is I'd put that athlete in under fluoroscopy or CT scan, and I would inject a corticosteroid in the vicinity of that impingement onto the nerve root. So I take him to the CT scanner, but any of you who've worked with spinal cord injured patients would know that as you take somebody out of a wheelchair and put them lying flat like this, what happens is the whole body goes into spasm. There's a whole shaking of the entire body. Now, I'm used to that, but certainly this interventional radiologist wasn't used to that at all. So now he's got to take a needle and try put that through the neck, not knowing when this person is going to have their spasms. So he tells me he's going to be this close away from the vertebral artery. There's no ways he's going ahead with this procedure. So I said to him, "Look, let's just leave it for a moment. Let's just see what happens to the spasms." And we time the spasms. And lo and behold, we find that there is a pattern to these spasms, that every 25 seconds the whole body goes into spasms lying in the CT scanner. So what we do is we undertake to try something different. We work through the neck, going down for 15 seconds, then we leave a 10-second gap, let the patient have his spasms, and then go further. And here you see them proceeding with the needle, going further, 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 until that needle is right there. It took us really a long time to do this procedure, to actually let the patient having his spasms until we're able to release the corticosteroid in that area of the nerve root. And this particular patient was able to play 2 days later and did very well. So this is the group of athletes that I look after. They are all here in Doha at the moment. And they what we call our Podium group of athletes. And I want to tell you a few of their particular stories. So these are my observations that I've had in the last 10 years of working with these athletes. And I'm going to speak to each of them. The first one is something I'm going to call transcendence. Secondly, the ability to deal with a gait. Third is humor. Fourth is reflection in the mirror. And 5 is gratitude. So let me explain these. And I introduce you to this athlete, and his name is Arno Fourie. And you'll see that he's had a below-knee amputation, and he's sitting next to his leg on the track, and he's not looking very happy. And the reason he's not looking happy is he came to me after arriving in Beijing after 2 days, and he said to me, "Doc, I've got a problem. I was doing starts today, and as I was out of the starting blocks, I felt something go here in my hammy, and I now can't even touch there. It's so sore I can't walk." And I go and I feel and I actually palpate there, and it's so sore I can't even do a proper examination. So I put him into a scanner. This is, just his history. And here you see the grade 2 to 3 muscle tear of the hamstring muscles. I send this via the internet to my radiologist that I work with in Cape Town. And he says to me, "Shame, he should actually come back on the next plane." And this didn't happen to one of our athletes. It happened to a second one here. This is a 26-year-old arm amputee long jumper. 2 days before competition, he presents with an acute hamstring. Again, tender on palpation. We do an MRI and we see quite a large 13 centimeter lesion there. Again, in a bit more detail, looking at it in this area over here. And we know that if you read a textbook, the textbook will advise you that this is going to take a minimum of about 2 weeks before this athlete can now rehabilitate and return to play. So both these athletes were advised to withdraw for physiotherapy and evaluation and rehabilitation. And these athletes both absolutely refused. And 2 days after these injuries were sustained, the outcome was the one jumped a silver medal, recording a personal best off that hamstring. You can see that that was the leading leg that he had. The other sprinter, T44, he ran a personal best and just missed a bronze medal 2 days after these hamstring injuries were sustained. Now, I have never seen this before in my life. I don't know how these guys do it. I've documented now and I've written it up of transcendence of musculoskeletal injury in athletes with disability during major competition. I've now counted 6 in my career that I can't understand how they get back so quickly. Very interesting. This is a very religious group of athletes. And I'm not sure if it is their belief system that allows them to transcend this type of injury. But this was before Beijing. You can see he's looking worried, I'm looking worried. And in London, 4 years afterwards, to the day, we recreated this picture. You can see he's looking happy, I'm looking much older. And what happened was history. He gave the baton over to Pistorius, who actually brought South Africa home in a new world record time of 41. So all these stories, luckily, have a very happy ending. So that's transcendence of injury. The second observation is something I'm going to call the ability to deal with the gait. And when I got home from the Paralympic Games, I took my wife to Stellenbosch to a place called Spear, who many of you might know. And Spear is a wine estate with a restaurant called Moyo, which is a very famous restaurant. And at the back, there's a long jogging track through the vineyards and the mountains. And we are runners, so we decided to go before dinner for a run. And as we're coming back on this path, I look and the gate is closed. And now I start being unkind to my wife. I say, you see, you wanted us to go for a run before dinner now. And now we're going to be late because we've got to run back for 5 kilometers. And you know what happens if you're late for dinner? All of the steak and all of the good fish is taken and there's nothing left for us. And now because you've insisted that we go for this, she says to me, shh, look. She says, look closely at the gate. And I look at the gate and I see that there's no wire on either side of the gate here. So I just walk around the gate. My wife's always right. I know this now. I don't even fight with her anymore. I walk around the gate, and that night, we had our supper. We weren't late. We had lots of steak and everything else. And that night I woke up and I thought, this gate, I must go early in the next morning and take a picture of this gate because this gate is teaching me a lesson. So the next morning at dawn, you can see the sun coming over the mountain here. I went to go take a picture of this gate. Because this gate is the story of the Paralympics. Because in all of our lives, this gate comes down. And I look at the age of the people in this room and I know that that gate has come down in perhaps nearly everybody's life here. That can be in loss of a loved one. It can be in illness. It can be in loss of a financial fortune. It can be loss of a child. It can be anything that is disastrous. And it can be loss of a limb or an accident that confines somebody to a wheelchair. And what happens is that you sit in front of this gate that comes down in your path of life. And you look at that gate, and you correctly feel depressed and bad about it. But in these athletes, something happens that they actually get up and just walk around that gate and carry on the path. And that has been one of my research interests, to find out what makes somebody different to somebody else that actually allows them to actually pick up and walk around the gate. And indeed, that is the topic of one of the research studies that we're doing here in Doha at these World Championships with the psychology of resilience. But I want to show you what this gate looks like and how Paralympians walk around that gate. So this guy's Peter, and Peter is the chef de mission for South Africa at the last Paralympic Games. Here he's got no arm at all. Here he's got just a below elbow. He lost his arms when he was 20 years old. He was holding a wire that somebody threw a switch, and this off wire was turned on, and he lost his arms due to electric current. Do you know that sharing a room with Peter was the most amazing experience for me? Not once, in fact, I remember now, to be honest, twice, I was asked to help him. The once was to cut a tough piece of steak, and the other was to tie a shoelace that he was battling on the one side. But that was the only things that he asked me to do for him. Absolutely everything else this man does with a quarter of an arm. So when it's his turn to sign, as the chef de mission does, on the pillar in the Olympic or Paralympic village, he does that by balancing that pen on his arm, and he uses his arm to sign. And when we go to the equestrian events and want to actually take some pictures, then he flips out his camera with his tongue. He uses a soft touch to actually get the camera in focus, and with his teeth, he uses that to depress the shutter to actually take his picture, and his pictures are far better than mine. And then every now and again you see a man who is shaped like a triangle. And you realize that the reason he's in that triangle is that he has lost his arms. And when you lose both your arms, there's only one thing that does this, and that is electricity. Electricity allows all the tissues to be taken away, the necrotic tissues. And this man changed the way that I think about disability. And he's standing here with the South African physiotherapist, Bafana Shalali. And what happens is that Bafana and I were in the changing rooms at the swimming venue. We were standing against a wall. There were two urinals. We're doing what gentlemen usually do at a urinal. And we're speaking to each other. Ladies, that's what men do in the urinals. They speak to each other. They've got a big mirror over here where we can see behind us. And we see these two Chinese athletes run in with the long swimming costumes in their neck like this. And they changed in these short costumes. So now we decide, no, we must stay here and we must look in the mirror how these two guys are going to get changed. So we'd finished doing what we had to do long ago, but we're standing there looking in the mirror and we're watching. And we see these two guys sit alongside each other. So can you imagine actually what it takes to actually go down and sit on the ground without using your arms? They've learnt an eccentric contraction of the hamstring that allows them to actually go down and sit on their behind softly. Then what happens, they face each other. The one extends his foot and hooks it into the costume. And then he takes the costume off, the other athlete. Then it's the other guy's turn. He hooks it round and he takes the costume off. And then something that looks like a finely choreographed ballet in which they actually balance against each other. They dress each other in these long costumes, and they're up there and out in about 2 minutes. And Bafana and I look at each other, And we know that our lives are changed, because how can you tell me that these men are disabled? They have shown supreme ability to actually do what they have done, because I certainly couldn't have done that. They've adapted their life to a great extent. And look at this Chinese athlete here. He's using his iPhone here with his toes in order to film the swimming event. And if you look very carefully, he's got headphones. I don't know how those headphones got in there, because he doesn't have arms. And if the only way that you can have a party and dance is from your wheelchair, then that's what it is that you do. And if the way that you're going to have fun on your scooter is use your blades, then that's how you get around that gate, and that's what you do. And this is Emily. Emily lost her leg due to an osteosarcoma, right high up, a high amputation. But you look at her diving into the water, and you can't tell me that her asymmetry gives her nothing more than the most perfect symmetry that you've actually seen in the beauty of an athlete. And you know what? If you've got no legs, then that's fine. You jump in and you swim to the other side, and then your legs will be waiting for you when you get back. And don't tell me that only having one leg and no arms doesn't allow you to be an archer. Because here's an archer that has got just that. And he uses his mouth to actually shoot that arrow and come within a 10 centimeter radius from a bull's eye, a long way away. My third observation is humor. And it's not any humor. And it is particular across whichever country that you speak about, across many different nations. Humor is typical of Paralympic athletes. And it's not humor of a normal manner. It is humor that is self-deprecating. It's aimed at oneself and one's own limitations. Because how I understand this now is, if you have the ability to laugh at yourself, then you remove the ego out of the picture and you're truly able to engage in the competition. So let me give you an example. This is the swimming. This is the swimming for people who have a severe visual disability, blind swimmers. They make sure that the swimmers are all blind because they give them eye covers to wear, blacked out goggles. Now, the people that are standing here are called tappers. And what they've got to do is, when the athlete is coming to the edge of the pool, they've got to tap them on the head with these little polystyrene knobs, and they tap them on the head, and then the athlete knows that they're right close to the wall, and they do a tumble turn and push off the wall and swim the next length. Well, the funniest thing at the Paralympic Games happened in the pool. Just incidentally, this is a visual disability. This is a central visual disability. This is not what the Paralympic athletes have. To be a Paralympic athlete, you have got a reduction of vision between 5 to 10% left. This person has got 60% left. This is more like what a Paralympic athlete sees. So you can imagine, if you are either a B1 or B2. B1 is totally blind. B2, you've got some vision left. You can't actually see the lane at the bottom of the pool, so you actually can swim skew. If you've got no vision at all, you're definitely going to swim skew. So what happens is they start a race. This is the 100 meters backstroke for B1. The guys start, and they go, and they go, and they go. And as blind swimmers would in the middle of the pool, one of these swimmers puts his hand over the side of the pool, hits the athlete on the head next to him, and the athlete in the middle of the pool does a tumble turn and tries to push off. But such as Paralympic swimmers are, they get to the end of the pool, they all get out the pool because they stop the race. They take all the guys over, explain to them what has happened. They say, oh, that's funny. They all have a big laugh and they start the race again. There's no problem. So my fourth observation is reflection in the mirror. And I go back to my own stuff here. And what I realize, and I thank these athletes for, is to hold up a mirror for me. so that I can see my own disability in this all. And I realized that actually when I didn't want to be the doctor for this team, it was really just looking at my own inability or nervousness to actually go and treat these athletes. And when it came to London, I asked not to go to the Olympic Games. I actually asked to go to the Paralympic Games, and shortly after that joined the Paralympic Committee to try and further the science of medicine in this particular endeavor. And certainly what it's made me do is have a degree of gratitude for what I have. Because that's one of the gifts that you get from working with athletes with disability, is that you take stock of what you have. And you know, every time I use this picture to educate an audience, and I look at this Mexican athlete, and he chooses not to go on a wheelchair, and he chooses not to go on two prostheses, but he chooses to actually walk slowly on wooden stumps. And if you look carefully, he is pulling his own luggage. Nobody is helping this man. He's doing it all himself. And what it means for me is that we're all like one of these pairs of shoes. We're all individuals like one of these shoes. And I realize that ability and disability are all on a continuum. There's no either or. And it's not only in physical, it's in mental, and it's in spiritual and emotional areas of our lives as well. And where we choose to be on this continuum of disability and ability every day is a choice. So I've seen some fantastically magnificent athletes being totally disabled. Totally disabled. Either because they're complaining, or they're busy with doping, or they are absolutely not doing what they should. And here I've shown you today some examples of athletes with disability being supremely able. And where we choose to be on that continuum is up to us. So inspire a generation. Well, this is what happened during the 2012 Paralympics. The teacher at this school in South Africa asked the class of 6-year-olds to draw somebody I would like to be. And this child drew Arno Fourie. He's energetic, he's happy, he's kind, he's an athlete, he's fast, he's my teacher's husband, and he has a leg that looks like a hockey stick. And this child has drawn Mr. Perfect. He's a runner, he's fast, he's got a prosthetic leg, and he's cool. So in the eyes of this child, this is Mr. Perfect, because he is what he is. And you know what? He's cool. So did London achieve that in maybe inspiring a generation? Certainly, I think that the way we think about disability is something that is changing, and that Rio now will take further one more step. So in my own work, this is where we are at the moment. You know the Van Mechelen model. I'm sure Willem has been here to describe this to you. But we know that it works in 4 stages. You've got to quantify any problem in sport, looking at the incidence and severity. The second step is establish the etiology and mechanisms of injury. The third step is to introduce a preventative measure. And then what one does is measure again. So we know that this schema is how sports medicine works, and those of us working in all the different federations, we know that these are the programs that we are busy instituting, whether that's FIFA, whether it's IAAF, whether it's UCI. So where we are in Paralympic sport is here. We're right at the beginning, because there's so many categories, and we don't know what the dangers are for the various different categories. So my colleagues and I designed this web-based system where the team physicians are able to input their data every day, and we know that with the epidemiology of sports injury and illnesses, we know that it's the denominator data that's most important, the exposure data, and this allows these doctors and physiotherapists to capture all of this. We've done that for London. We've done that for Sochi. We've started with advanced algorithms looking at mechanisms of injury in all the different winter sports. We're moving into the summer sports with this now as well. And we've had this in 2012. We had 3 major papers in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. We've subsequently had another 4 or 5 published where we're starting to really document and get into the nitty-gritty of discerning where we're going to go with injury and illness prevention. So, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I just want to thank you very much for your attention. I also want to say that for those of you who found this interesting, please be aware that on the 24th, that is on Saturday, we have a full morning symposium where we're going to go into a lot of these things in a lot more practical detail for people who are interested in learning more about sport and exercise medicine in this very important group of elite athletes. Thank you very much for your attention.